Good day. More than a week after the Hamas attack on Israel, we are in a situation where it is still unclear exactly what the next steps are going to be. Israel continues to bombard Gaza, and I've been hearing some extraordinary figures about the numbers of bombs that Israeli aircraft are launching towards Gaza. There's been reports that over the course of 6 days, Israel has dropped 6,000 precision-guided American-produced and Israeli-produced bombs from its air force. Now, that would amount to something like 1,000 bombs a day, and it compares, perhaps, to give a sense of comparison, a short time ago, I was discussing an article by the London Times about the fighting in Ukraine and about the Russian airstrikes on the town of Orekhov, which is the major staging base for Ukrainian attacks towards Rabotino and Verbovoye. And the London Times reported on the information provided by a Ukrainian soldier that the Russians were dropping around 25 to 30 precision-guided bombs on Orekhov each day. 25 to 30. Now, of course, the Russians are dropping many more bombs in many more places across the battle lines, but still, 1,000 bombs dropped in a relatively small area of around 350 kilometers, 1,000 bombs a day. If these numbers are true, and I can't, of course, verify them, well, that gives us a sense of the difference, the sheer difference in scale. Now, there's a number of points to be made here. The Russians have come late to the business of precision-guided bombs, and of course it is taking them time to produce them in quantity, and undoubtedly that is a factor, whereas the United States and Israel have been busy producing precision-guided bombs, well, since the 1980s, and they have them in vast quantities. But how vast, how big, ultimately, is the American arsenal and the Israeli arsenal of these types of bombs? Can they continue to drop bombs at a rate of 1,000 a day? I have to say, I do wonder, perhaps some people who follow these things more closely than me and who have access to this type of information or know where to find it can provide the answer. But I suspect that if Israel is indeed dropping 1,000 bombs on Gaza a day, that kind of offensive, aerial offensive, is ultimately unsustainable. That's the first thing I want to say about this. The second thing to say is that, of course, if one is dropping 1,000 bombs a day on a densely populated area, that is undoubtedly going to cause massive damage, huge numbers of casualties. There are already reports to that effect. And of course, there's also these Israeli demands that people from northern Gaza evacuate to southern Gaza. Some sections of the Western media are reporting that some Palestinians are heeding these warnings or demands, but it's also clear to me that quite a few others are choosing to stay where they are, as Hamas is telling them to do. So anyway, that's a second point, that dropping such a heavy load of bombs is going to inevitably result in civilian casualties. The third point I'm going to make, and of course, let me repeat once more that all of this is conditional on Israel having indeed dropped that many bombs. I find it almost impossible to imagine, but perhaps it has. But anyway, if it is dropping bombs on that scale, then again, I do wonder whether the bombs that have been dropped are being used as precision weapons in the way that they're supposed to be used. I wonder how precise strikes can take place 1,000 times a day. Just saying. Anyway, these are questions. I don't have the answers. Others can perhaps provide them. As I said, I would be very grateful if people, in perhaps comments on the threads to this video, could actually confirm whether this figure of 1,000 bombs dropped a day by the Israeli Air Force is true. That would, by the way, imply that virtually the entire Air Force is operating now and round the clock. But anyway, whether those figures are actually true, and also perhaps respond to these other questions. Anyway, that's the first thing I'm going to say about the fighting at the moment. There is still no ground operation on any scale. Apparently, special forces troops, Israeli special forces troops, have been entering Gaza at various places and at various points, but there doesn't seem to be any indication yet of any major ground operation. And the suggestions that this is still being delayed, perhaps following calls of restraint from the United States and from Europe. It's a very interesting article in the Financial Times, which says that Western diplomats are walking an impossible tightrope with Israel. Both European and American officials are attempting to juggle support with calls for restraint. And the article, which is by Gideon Rachman, goes on to say, as Israel prepares for an apparently inevitable ground invasion of Gaza, a flurry of Western diplomats and politicians are arriving in Jerusalem, but visitors from the United States and Europe have a complicated and arguably contradictory message. They want to express complete support for Israel in striking back against Hamas, but they're also urging Israel to act with restraint. And then we go on to read, in Brussels, there is some nervousness about the fact that Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, has arrived in Israel just as the country's government is urging more than 1 million Gazans to leave the north of the Strip. The concern is that the European Commission President could look as if she's endorsing military actions that will cause mass civilian casualties and that will swiftly be labelled as war crimes. And then we have a quote from an anonymous EU official. Let me make it clear. This is all from Gideon Rachman's attitude in the Financial Times. We may be about to see massive ethnic cleansing. That's, as I said, attributed to an EU diplomat and published by the Financial Times. Another senior Brussels official said that the EU should already have lined up with the UN Secretary General's calls for Israel to respect international humanitarian law. And then there is further very interesting comment in the Financial Times. There is very little confidence in Western capitals that Israel will listen to calls for restraint. They think they're facing a second potential Holocaust and fighting for the survival of the state, says the EU official. They are not going to listen to us. European diplomats have also been struck by how little interest the Israeli government has shown in prioritizing the lives of the hostages held in Gaza, some of whom come from European countries. And there's also exact concern about exactly what I predicted, the hope in some Western capitals in Israel that the Egyptian government would open the border with Gaza and allow the Gazans to evacuate from Gaza into Egypt. Financial Times tells us it's not happening. Western officials have been talking to their Egyptian counterparts about the possibility of Egypt opening its border with Gaza to allow refugees to leave the country, but the Egyptians are currently adamant that they will do no such thing. They argue that they're already hosting refugees from other conflicts, such as the one in Sudan, and they share concerns that once Israel has forced the Palestinians out of Gaza, it will never let them back. And in fact, there are other reports now appearing that the Egyptians, far from opening the border between Egypt and Gaza, is taking further steps to seal it, blocking tunnels, reinforcing checkpoints, doing all of those sort of things. So any hope, any expectation that these millions of people trapped in Gaza can be expelled into Egypt, something which many believe is the underlying Israeli policy. There have been rumors about this. There was that alleged conversation between Netanyahu and Mubarak all those years ago. If there is such a plan, and I'm not, by the way, I want to make this clear, I haven't actually seen any Israeli official say so far that there is such a plan, well, it's clearly not working. The Egyptians are not allowing it to happen. And of course, within Gaza itself, Hamas is telling people to stay where they are. So we see that there is an impasse on that front, and we see that there's also concern in Western capitals. But let's go back to these calls on Israel to exercise restraint. Is that really why Israel has not yet launched its ground offensive? Or is it perhaps because the Israelis themselves are worried that if they launch a ground offensive at this moment in time, then the result will be that the Israeli forces will become bogged down in heavy fighting, for which they're not ready, and that this is in fact the major cause that is causing the Israelis to hold back. There's a long article by Lawrence Friedman in the Financial Times, again, talking about the extremely complicated challenge that Israel faces in trying to assert control over Gaza, eradicate Hamas there, purely as a military operation. This is going to be extremely complicated and very difficult. And it could be that that is more what is causing the problems. Who's to say? But anyway, it could also be, and this is another thing to add, that Israel is still in the process of building up its forces, mobilizing reservists, doing those sort of things. And it could be that it is that which is causing Israel to hold back. Having said that, there is an article in Bloomberg. There's been, in fact, more. It's been there for some hours, which says that the Biden administration hasn't yet really been able to work out from the Israelis what their plan is. Now, it should be said that this article suggests that what's bothering the administration is that Israel doesn't seem to have a long-term plan beyond the destruction of Hamas. But it could also be the case that the Biden administration is finding that, for the moment at least, Israel doesn't actually have a plan about how it is going to go about destroying Hamas. that it is still trying to develop some kind of plan and some kind of way of achieving what looks like being a very difficult objective. The Egyptians, as I said, have closed the border. They're not allowing people to leave Gaza. Advancing into Gaza could result in heavy casualties for Israeli troops. Bombing Gaza continuously might not in itself solve the problem, given that Hamas reputedly has a vast network of bunkers and tunnels, and that they're able to absorb some of the damage from some of this bombing. And an indefinite blockade of Gaza, cutting off food, water and power to Gaza, sooner or later it's going to start provoking more and more international criticism, inevitably, as the humanitarian catastrophe deepens. I will say that there continues to be extremely emotional, extremely dangerous rhetoric coming out of Israel. The president of Israel, Mr. Herzog, has made comments, for example, in which he's talked about the entire population of Gaza bearing some responsibility for what happened a week ago. At least that is how I construe his words. He said that they didn't take steps to overthrow the Hamas government that has established itself in their midst. He's not explaining exactly how that could happen or why that would happen. But anyway, all of that could be seen as providing some kind of justification for radical action, which, to come back to what Gideon Rachman was saying in his article, and I want to stress again, it is the Financial Times, it is Gideon Rachman who's talking about the European Union president could look, by arriving in Israel at this time, as if she's endorsing military actions that will cause mass civilian casualties that will be swiftly labelled as war crimes. And EU diplomats, again according to the Financial Times, are now warning about, well, we may be about to see massive ethnic cleansing. And that is a direct quote from an EU diplomat, which appears in the Financial Times. So it is not correct to say, as some people are saying it, that these things are just being said on independent media, in social media, in Arab and Islamic places, channels. Even the EU, even EU officials are now starting to become worried that the situation is in danger of getting completely out of control, and that this could result in war crimes, further war crimes being committed, with these war crimes, some of them at least, being carried out by Israel. So that's what the Financial Times is saying, and all the indications point to that being true. Well, I've talked about the EU, and notice, by the way, how Western officials and European officials, again according to the Financial Times, now understand or sense that the Israelis are not, frankly, very interested in listening to what they have to say. This is the second time, by the way, over the course of the last couple of days, when EU officials have been complaining that they're not getting the attention and respect that they expect to receive from various third parties they're saying this now about Israel. Josep Borrell, on a trip to China, has said this about China also. The EU is discovering that far from being a great geopolitical heavyweight and power that everybody listens to, they are becoming an irrelevance. Well, that is a topic for another day. But anyway, we see that the EU is worried about these things, and of course the EU is more measured in what it says than others. We see that these comments by EU officials are being made anonymously to the Financial Times and are being published there, but the EU officials who make them are not prepared to come out and put their names to what they say and to say them publicly. But others are far less reticent. And President Putin of Russia in Kyrgyzstan has again been speaking further about this crisis. And he has done so over the course of a press conference which he's conducted in Bishkek. It is a very interesting press conference. It covers all types of topics, discussed extensively the issue with the ruble, and made it very clear that the Russians are now working towards re-establishing exchange controls, capital controls, which, by the way, I strongly suspect will become permanent before long. China and India have capital controls. Why shouldn't Russia, now that it has moved away from the West? Another topic for another day. But anyway, today I'm going to focus very much on what he is saying about the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, the crisis in Gaza and in southern Israel. And this is what he says. He said, Israel has, of course, faced an unprecedented attack that has never been seen before in history, only in terms of its scale, but also in terms of the nature of its execution, its brutality. Well, we must call it as we see it. Israel is responding on a massive scale and also with quite brutal methods. Of course, we understand the logic of the events, but despite all the brutality on both sides, I still believe that we certainly need to think about the civilian population. We said that earlier, and I want to reiterate, we are now seeing assessments in the United States of what is happening, and various options are being proposed for the further course of events, including the suggestion that military and non-military measures could be taken against the Gaza Strip in the same way as during the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. Now, what happened in Leningrad during the Second World War is that the Germans placed the city, Russia's former capital, St. Petersburg, called by that name again, but the Russians still refer to the siege of the city during the Second World War as the siege of Leningrad. Anyway, the Germans put Leningrad under siege. They cut off supplies of food into the city. Power supplies collapsed. And by some calculations, around 1 million people died. And if you go to St. Petersburg today, you will see that the effect of the siege remains very much a part of people's memory and memory of the city. It was one of the most catastrophic events of the Second World War and one of the most catastrophic experiences that the Soviets, the Russians, experienced in what they call the Great Patriotic War that they fought on the Eastern Front. I would add that Leningrad never fell. The Soviets did manage to create access points to Leningrad across the ice, across the Gulf of Finland. It was incredibly dangerous, but some food was provided and some people, especially children, and by the way, various intellectuals like the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, were evacuated. But massive devastation was done, and there was colossal loss of life. It's also important to remember, in the context of Putin's own words, that he is, of course, a native of the city. He was born in St. Petersburg in the early 1950s, when it was, of course, still Leningrad, and at a time when the memory of what happened was very fresh, and, of course, everybody that he would have known, all of the adults he would have known, the members of his own family, some of the older children that he would have met at school, and later in his life, all of them would have lived, many of them would have lived through this and would have been traumatized and scarred by the experience. So when Putin talks about something happening in Gaza akin to the siege of Leningrad, well, for him personally, but also for millions of Russians, this is a powerful thing to remember. And he goes on to say, we understand what that entails, and I think it is unacceptable. More than 2 million people live there. Not all of them support Hamas, by the way, yet everyone, including women and children, must suffer. Of course, hardly anyone would agree to that. And that's a message sent, essentially, to the Israelis. And then he goes on to say, on the other hand, I said today in a meeting with my colleagues, he means the leaders of the Commonwealth of Independent States, those who attended this meeting in Bishkek, that Israel, of course, has the right to ensure its security and create guarantees for that security. But tools to achieve that must be found. A way out of the situation must be found. In my view, this can be achieved, of course, including through some kind of mediation efforts. So he's now floating the possibility of mediation. As I have repeatedly said, there are many of our compatriots, former citizens of the Soviet Union and of Russia, living today in Israel. This factor is real for us, of course. We cannot forget about it. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we have very good relations going back many years and decades with the Arab world, and first of all, of course, with Palestine, which was once promised that a Palestinian state would be established with East Jerusalem as its capital. They were promised that, and decisions were taken at the UN level. They have the right to expect these promises to be kept. All of this taken together should be addressed, and, of course, first of all, we should think about the people who are not to blame for the current escalation. It is impossible to pretend that no one sees this and does not understand it and leaves it out of the equation. And again, clearly here, he is addressing the Israelis. He says we have to find a sustainable solution. We know all the things you've been saying. We know all the opposition you've previously expressed towards the establishment of a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. But look at the alternatives. What you're talking about, what you're proposing to do in Gaza, risks a humanitarian catastrophe if it creates a situation analogous to the siege of Leningrad. Well, you're going to do something that no part of humanity will agree to, and which you yourselves will be at some point eventually ashamed of, and which will in any event have massive political repercussions against yourselves. And we see that he's right about that. We see that even the EU now, according to that article in the Financial Times, is becoming uneasy. And By extension, what Putin is trying to say to the Israelis is, look, there is no military solution to this problem. You've been trying to find one ever since your state was founded back in the 1940s. What you must do is seek peace. And in order to seek peace, you need proper mediation, not the phony mediation provided up to this point by the United States. And then a journalist, Edmund Zhelbunev, asks Putin, can Russia assist in that? And then Putin goes on to say this: Russia can, precisely because we have good relations with Israel over the past, say, 15 years, absolutely, and we have traditionally good relations with Palestine. So no one would suspect us of wanting to take sides, but only if, of course, someone needs our mediation. This is always done only on the basis of agreements between the parties. So again, Putin is saying to the Israelis, look, you want us to act as a mediator. We are prepared to do it. We've explained to you what our thinking is, that this has to be negotiated. There has to be a long-term sustainable solution which must involve the creation of a Palestinian state within its 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Americans, who pretended to mediate this conflict up to this point, have failed completely because they have not been proper mediators. If you want us to step in, we are prepared to do that. We are on good terms with you. We are on good terms with the Arab states. We're on good terms with the Palestinians. We do not seek to take sides in this matter. We are not aiming for the victory of one side over the other. You can rely on us, therefore, to be impartial. That is what Putin is saying, and he's telling the Israelis, it is in your interests to take that approach. Now, there were reports yesterday, which I have not been able to confirm, that the Russian government has now conveyed to the UN Security Council mediation proposals for an immediate ceasefire and a cessation of attacks on civilians and for the release of hostages. Now, I don't know whether this is the case. I don't know what the response within the UN Security Council is going to be. I don't know what the attitude of the Western powers will be. They will certainly not be happy to support a Russian proposed resolution. But anyway, I interpret this, if this move has actually happened, as a first move. And interestingly, Hamas has to some extent responded to Putin's words. They've said, look, we've heard all that Putin is saying. We couch it, we express it in our own words, which go well beyond anything that Putin himself would have said. But we appreciate the position he is taking. And yes, if there is a ceasefire and if there is a serious proposal for a ceasefire brokered by the Russians, then we, for one, will go along with it. We will be prepared to go forward with this, and by extension, we would be prepared to be part of the kind of negotiation process that Putin is talking about. Now, I cannot imagine at the present time, at the present moment, Israel agreeing to any of this, but bear in mind that Putin and others are not, I think, looking for an immediate change of course from Israel. They are building up their position for the point when the Israelis come to realize that whatever military operation they're planning in Gaza, I come back to that long article by Lawrence Freeman in the Financial Times, in which he says that there's no good options for the Israelis and none that will guarantee any kind of success for them. What the Russians are doing is that they're preparing the ground for that step, for the step when it's recognized that this is the military option. It's recognized in Israel that the military options have gone as far as they can when international criticism starts to build, and we already see the first signs of doubt in Europe, within the EU, and when the Israelis themselves start to see that they have to find some sort of way out. Anyway, that's what Putin is doing. He's laying down a marker for a situation that might develop and evolve over the next few weeks and months. Now, arguably the most powerful country in the world, other than the United States, has finally weighed in. And I've said that a BRICS peace initiative is almost certainly on the cards. And we can see from the statements that the Chinese are making, to be precise, Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking at a press conference with Josep Borrell. Now we can see from the Chinese that they are fully on board with this and that they are actually moving in that same direction themselves. As I have said many times, there has undoubtedly been a heavy traffic of contacts between the Chinese and the Russians. They're undoubtedly in constant communication with each other and have been throughout this latest eruption of this conflict. And a joint initiative, a BRICS initiative, is almost certainly underway, going to emerge with the Chinese and the Russians perhaps co-sponsoring it alongside the other BRICS states. So, the Chinese have provided a readout, and it comes, this is a readout of what Wang Yi is supposed to have said over the context of a press meeting with the press after Wang Yi's apparently not very successful meeting with Josep Borrell. And I'm going to read out the Chinese readout in full. When asked about the current Palestinian-Israeli situation, Foreign Minister Wang Yi pointed out that Palestine is now in a critical situation. The ongoing conflict has caused heavy civilian casualties. The humanitarian situation is rapidly deteriorating. China condemns all acts that harm civilians and opposes any violation of international law. Wang Yi highlighted 4 priorities that China sees pressing given the severity of the current situation. The first is to stop the fighting as soon as possible, prevent it from spreading endlessly, and avoid further deterioration of the situation. Second, it is imperative to observe international humanitarian law, make every effort to ensure the safety of civilians, open up a humanitarian rescue and assistance package as quickly as possible, and prevent a severe humanitarian disaster. Third, relevant countries should stay calm and exercise restraint. That's obviously referencing Israel, but arguably other countries like Iran as well. Take an objective and just position. That's also the United States. Work for de-escalation of the conflict and avoid causing an even bigger blow to regional and international security. Fourth, The United Nations should play its due role in resolving the question of Palestine. The UN Security Council needs to shoulder important responsibilities for this and build international consensus as quickly as possible and take real measures to that end. Wang Yi pointed out that China is communicating with relevant parties. China will actively participate in emergency consultations at the UN Security Council and support the call by Secretary General Guterres for protecting civilians. China will provide emergency humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian National Authority through the United Nations. Wang Yi pointed out that the question of Palestine is at the heart of the Middle East issue and a wound that keeps being torn open in today's world. The root cause of this question lies in the long delay in realizing the dream of an independent state of Palestine and the failure to redress the historical injustice suffered by the Palestinian people. Israel has the right to statehood. So does Palestine. The Israelis have obtained the safeguards for survival, but who will care about the survival of the Palestinians? The Jewish nation is no longer homeless in the world, but when will the Palestinian nation return to its home? There is no shortage of injustices in the world, but the injustice to Palestine has dragged on for half a century. The sufferings that plagued generations must not continue. The answer to the question is the two-state solution and an independent state of Palestine. This is how Palestine and Israel can coexist in peace and how Arabs and Jews can live in harmony. Only when the two-state solution is fully implemented can the Middle East truly enjoy peace and Israel enjoy lasting security. The right way to advance the two-state solution is to resume peace talks as soon as possible. All mechanisms for peace must play a positive role. The special envoy of the Chinese government on the Middle East will soon visit relevant countries in the region and make active efforts to facilitate a cessation of violence. In the meantime, China calls for more authoritative, influential, and broad-based international peace conference to be held under the auspices of the United Nations to build international consensus for peace and work for a comprehensive, just and lasting solution to the question of Palestine at an early date. So, every single point that Putin has been making, the issue of Palestine is the core issue. The solution in order to create peace is to return to the two-state solution proposed way back in 1947 by the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and reiterated in subsequent UN Security Council resolutions, principally UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967. And in effect, what Wang Yi is saying, we have to return to that principle. And he is making it clear again that alongside the Russians, the Chinese are prepared to offer a mediation process, and that it has to be a long-term solution. And in the meantime, there needs to be a ceasefire, an end of attacks on civilians, a cessation of fighting. The single most important points, however, made by Wang Yi are those at the end. He talks about a UN-led mediation effort to be carried out by something which rather nebulously the Chinese readout talks about as a established conference. I am going to suggest that the discussion that is underway, and that there is one, is, as I've said previously, for a BRICS peace plan, a mediation peace plan. The BRICS, at some point over the next few weeks and months, are going to propose to the UN Security Council, and if it fails there, they will probably take it to the General Assembly. They're going to put together a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, a release of hostages, a opening up of humanitarian corridors into Gaza, conceivably even a deployment of some kind of peacekeeping force to Gaza. They're also going to call for the process of mediation to be taken out of the hands of the United States, and this reference to a conference suggests to me a revival of that idea for a peace conference to settle once and for all the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel and the Arab states to be perhaps held in Geneva. What was originally proposed, and also, by the way, supported by relevant UN Security Council resolutions at the end of the 1973 war, that is where we're heading. And this is going to be, as I said, proposed before long. I'm going to suggest it's going to be a joint BRICS initiative. All the BRICS states effectively are in agreement about this. It will also be backed by the Arab League and the African Union. It will have overwhelming support across the global south. No one should expect this to happen immediately. We're probably going to see an intensification of the fighting over the next few weeks, perhaps months, but at some point this will be proposed to the UN Security Council. The United States will be challenged. The United States and the Western powers will be challenged either to support it or to veto it. If it is vetoed, I suspect the BRICS states will take it to the UN General Assembly, and I expect there that this proposal, when it is finally made, will overwhelmingly pass. Now, what happens next remains to be seen. It would be a diplomatic defeat for the United States were that to happen. And personally, I would not be surprised if eventually in Israel itself there are some people who finally start to understand the logic of this and begin to understand, especially if whatever military operation Israel has in mind fails to achieve a satisfactory outcome, that the only practical way forward is the one that is being proposed here by the Chinese and which has previously been highlighted by the Russians. Now, saying all of this, I understand that there are many people who question whether, with all those settlements now in the West Bank, it's going to be possible to achieve a two-state solution. Getting the settlers to leave the West Bank, which is what all of this implies, might be all but impossible. There's been lots of reports now, in fact, I'm sure that this is true, that one of the reasons that the Hamas fighters were able to penetrate so deep into Israel was precisely because tensions between settlers in the West Bank and the Palestinians there had spiked to extraordinarily high levels over the last couple of weeks, perhaps in connection with the events at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that the Israeli government redeployed 3 battalions of troops who had been guarding the border with Gaza, that they redeployed them to the West Bank, leaving only 1 battalion to try to hold back the Hamas fighters, a battalion which was quickly overwhelmed. Well, there we go. That, I'm sure, is true. I'm sure there's an awful lot more behind all of this that we will find out in due course. But anyway, the point is, it's going to be incredibly difficult, perhaps politically impossible in Israel, to evacuate the settlements from the West Bank. And it could therefore be, and I accept this, that the difficulties ahead in a negotiation process aimed at establishing a 2-state solution are all but insuperable. But what I think the Chinese and the Russians and the BRICS states and the others are probably saying to themselves is, look, let's get a negotiation, a real negotiation going. Let's get proper mediation efforts properly set up. Let's get the Israelis to finally sit down with the Palestinians. Let's get all the parties talking to each other. And then perhaps something, some way forward can emerge. Maybe very difficult, maybe all but impossible. Maybe the best opportunities for peace have already been lost. But what other real option is there? And not conducting negotiations might, well, all that is guaranteed to do is to let the situation deteriorate and get worse. Well, we shall see. I am not going to look too far ahead. I don't think anybody can. But I do think that a head of steam for some kind of negotiation, mediation proposal is definitely coming. And before long, we will see a concerted effort by the Chinese and the Russians, backed, I suspect, by the Arab states and by the global south, and through the vehicle of the BRICS, to wrest control of the mediation process in the Middle East from the United States. This is where all of this is leading to. It will take time to shape and happen. In the meantime, of course, the fighting in the Middle East goes on. And as the fighting in the Middle East goes on, so does the fighting in Ukraine. Now, there was a statement yesterday by Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the UN, in which he said that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is now ended. I think anybody observing the situation on the ground would have to agree. There's been admissions from a number of Western officials, including, in a kind of sleight of hand way, John Kirby, which now concede that it is indeed the Russians who are attacking in most places along the front lines. And the major points where the Russians are attacking continue to be Avdiivka, but also in the last few hours, there's been reports of a major Russian attacks towards Kupiansk. And in fact, the commander-in-chief, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, General Syrskyi, has spoken about a deteriorating situation around Kupiansk, even as he has apparently been obliged to withdraw troops from the Bakhmut area, to redeploy them towards Avdiivka in order to try to prevent these moves by the Russians to close the cauldron there. Now, about the situation in Avdiivka, there are the usual contradictory reports. I've been reading lots of reports over the last couple of days in the Western media about how the Russians have suffered heavy losses in the attacks near Avdiivka, how lots of Russian armoured vehicles have been destroyed. I've not actually seen very much in the way of film confirmation of this, but there's no reason to doubt that the fighting in this particular area has been extremely tough. One point which these Western reports do not, however, make clear is that when we talk about Russian troops in the Avdiivka area, as I discussed already, if you actually look at which formations are involved, which are the Russian military formations which are conducting the offensive in Avdiivka, they appear to be drawn from the First Corps, and they are, in other words, forces taken from what was, until recently, the Donetsk militia. Now, these troops have undoubtedly been re-equipped, retrained, reinforced by the Russians. They're no doubt a much more potent force than they were, say, a year ago, but they're still not, perhaps, regular Russian military. And again, it's striking that most of the operations that have been carried out, not all of them, by the Russians along the front lines, we still have not seen in large numbers the big, heavy Russian formations, the tank divisions, the armoured infantry, we're seeing them being built up, their forces being built up in huge numbers in the rear, preparatory for the big offensive, which, as I said, is supposed to happen sometime. I suspect it's going to happen sometime next year. And perhaps it's worth pointing out that so far the Russian Defense Ministry, no Russian official, has actually commented publicly about the fighting in Avdiivka, and they've said very little indeed about the fighting around Kupiansk. The Russian Defense Ministry bulletins are largely silent about the tactical moves in these places. They still talk about Ukrainian attacks being repelled and about numbers of Ukrainian troops being killed and about Ukrainian equipment losses. They're not talking about Russian advances. But having said that, there is clearly a serious Russian advance taking place around Avdiivka. The Russians apparently have clamped down hard on information about this, but undoubtedly it is still ongoing. Information still suggests that they still control the slag heap. I've seen some claims that they no longer do, but I understand that they actually do for the moment control the slag heap. And we will see what they achieve and what their ultimate plan for Avdiivka is. But in the meantime, they've also, it seems, launched this attack towards Kupiansk, which has General Syrski so worried. And there's also reports that they're pushing forward near Piatichatki and near Vugleda and in Marinka. They're increasing the pressure all the time. And I'm going to suggest that that is actually the objective. That is more the objective than necessarily capturing any one of these places. Obviously, they want to capture Kupiansk. Obviously, they want to capture Avdiivka. If they're able to trap Ukrainian troops there, they will do so. But for the moment, what they are seeking to do is to continue to conduct that attrition campaign that they have been waging ever since the middle of last year, wearing down, grinding down the Ukrainian army, thinning it, depleting its reserves, and of course, as I discussed, depleting its ammunition stocks and its equipment stocks. And of course, the fighting in the Middle East is going to accelerate that process even more. Many people have pointed out that John Kirby has been talking about the United States being at the end of the rope. He was talking about financial support for Ukraine. And I think that perhaps people are slightly over-analysing what John Kirby said. But with the Republicans now nominating Jim Jordan for House Speaker, it could be that American aid for Ukraine is going to further tail off, especially with these competing demands from Israel in the Middle East, in which case that, of course, is going to intensify Ukraine's problems. But coming back to that video that Brian Beletic and John Scott of Calibrated did about a week ago on the new Atlas, the Russian plan overall seems to me to be exactly what they said. Increase the pressure, keep attritioning the Ukrainians, force the Ukrainians to send troops from one part of the battlefront to another. We've just seen that Syrskyi has had to send troops from the Bakhmut area to reinforce their Ukrainian positions near Avdiivka. This has been reported, by the way, by Yan Gagin, who is a senior official of the Russian Donetsk regional government, and he's been one of the most regular commentators about this war, but he said that this is what the Ukrainians have been obliged to do. So the Ukrainians are having to reshuffle constantly their forces, trying to firefight in various places along the battle lines simultaneously. That's causing them to lose more men and machines, deplete their ammunition stocks even further. Their front lines are becoming thinner, and eventually, sooner or later, a breach in the Ukrainian defenses will take place, and then the cascade effect will begin, with one breach being followed by others, and eventually the whole thing, according to Brian Beletic and Scott have Calibrated, will lead to a larger collapse, even as the big Russian forces start to close in. And that, it seems to me, is the pattern which we are seeing. So the Russians push hard in Kupiansk, then they stop, then they start something in Avdiivka. I'm not saying they've stopped in Avdiivka, by the way. I haven't seen anything to suggest that, just saying. But anyway, even as Avdiivka heats up and the Ukrainians rush reinforcements there, the Russians then start up things again in Kupiansk, causing General Syrskyi to worry. And even as Ukrainian reserves get depleted and their ammunition stocks fall, and of course we saw from that article in the London Times that in respect of some of their guns, they're able only to launch one shell a day, and they're having to pull out of stock old Soviet cannons left over from the era of the Second World War, because at least they have some ammunition for them. So that, it seems to me, is the military picture on the front lines. Now, there's been a fairly interesting comment from a Ukrainian official, a senior Ukrainian official, and it's Mikhailo Podolyak, who is one of Zelensky's key advisors. And I'm just going to read what he said. He said, Ukraine is 6 to 9 months behind the planned offensive schedule. Immediately after the Kharkov operation, there was a shortage of artillery, so it was impossible to move on. Instead of doing it quickly in the fall of 2022, everything unfolded slowly in the fall. We worked out logistics, There were a lot of approvals. Even then, we were behind the delivery schedule because instead of receiving weapons in a week, we started receiving them in 3 to 4 months. And I'm going to say that this corroborates, vindicates a point which I have been making for many months now, which is that Ukraine's famous spring-summer counteroffensive was actually originally intended to take place last autumn. A year ago, there was going to be a series of sequential offensives. First, there was the one in Kharkiv, then there was going to be the one in Kherson. That was supposed to end when the Russian forces defending Kherson city were trapped on the west bank of the Dnieper, trying to defend Kherson city. And then directly after that debacle, there was going to be the coup de grace, the big Ukrainian offensive, breaking through weakened, enfeebled Russian defenses in Zaporozhye region, piling on towards the Sea of Azov, cutting off the Russian land bridge, and bringing the entire special military operation, the Russian special military operation, to a crashing end. I've been saying that this was the case for months, and we see that Mikhailo Podolyak has in effect confirmed it. And here we come back to these comments vindicating what someone else has also been saying. And that person, of course, is Brian Beletic. Brian Beletic has repeatedly said that Ukraine's military operations last autumn, the ones in Kharkiv and Kherson, were for Ukraine a military strategic failure. Ukraine's losses during those offensives were far greater than the Ukrainians had calculated or prepared for. Their forces were so heavily depleted in terms of their artillery, their equipment, that there simply weren't enough troops and machines and shells and equipment ready in the autumn to carry out the third offensive in the sequence, the advance from Orekhov through Zaporozhye to the sea. That, through the entire sequencing of schedule, as Podolyak says, and it has led directly to the failure of the offensive. The Russians not only inflicted massive damage on the Ukrainians over the course of the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, far greater than the Ukrainians anticipated, but they conserved their forces, they pulled them out of Kharkiv, and they pulled them out of Kherson region intact. And because of the damage they inflicted on the Ukrainians, the West was obliged to rebuild the Ukrainian forces through rushed training programs and rushed and ultimately ineffective re-equipment programs as well, all those Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s, and infantry fighting vehicles and all of the rest, giving the Russians time to build up their great fortified lines, reinforce their forces, first with reservists and then with extra volunteers, and in the meantime, continue to conduct further attrition on the Ukrainians through the Battle of Bakhmut. I suspect that when the history of this war is written, it will become clear that it was in the autumn of 2022 that Ukraine actually lost it. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about the situation in the Ukrainian front lines today. Suffice to say that this war continues, may be attracting less attention, but I'm going to suggest that it is, in geopolitical terms, at least as consequential as the war in the Middle East. And we will see where both of these conflicts go, but that will be a topic I'm going to return to now in my next program. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Remind you again, you can find all our videos, all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and especially X, the former Twitter. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop, check out the things that you will find there, our various things like magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.